Arthur Vance's world was a scream of white-hot needles. 14 months of a piercing electric frequency that made his very brain boil and his teeth ache with every thrum. Now, he is following a coordinate etched into his mind by blood and static. He stands before a rusted hatch in the woods, hearing the wet, mechanical heartbeat of something ancient. What if the noise isn't a disease, but a terrifying warning? Arthur Vance lived in a world that never stopped vibrating, a reality defined by a relentless frequency that had claimed his sanity on the 3rd of May, 2024. It had arrived without fanfare, manifesting first as the ghost of a sound, like the distant, rhythmic flutter of a mosquito trapped in the far corner of a darkened room. Within hours, the subtle hum had sharpened, transforming into a white-hot sliver of silver that seemed to pierce his skull from temple to temple with surgical precision. The sound was not organic but possessed a dry, electric quality, mimicking the menacing drone of high-voltage power lines straining under the weight of a heavy autumn rain. As he sat in his quiet apartment, the wallpaper seemed to pulse in time with the noise, and the very air grew thick with a static charge that made the hair on his arms stand in frozen anticipation. The doctors in their stiff white coats had become a recurring cast of silent actors in a play he could no longer follow. They peered into his dilated pupils with tiny, blinding flashlights and struck his joints with rubber hammers, their expressions a mixture of clinical curiosity and growing frustration. Arthur watched their lips move in slow, exaggerated arcs, but their words were mere ghosts, drowned out by the monolithic, unyielding scream of the frequency that filled his head. To him, the world had become a silent film where the only soundtrack was a single, monotonous tone that refused to break, a sound so high it felt like glass shattering against the inside of his teeth. They scribbled notes on clipboards and gestured toward various charts, their silent advice crumbling against the wall of noise that had become his new, solitary religion. Sleep became a forgotten luxury, replaced by a grueling vigil in the suffocating stillness of his bedroom. In the absence of external noise, the vibration inside his head gained a physical weight, evolving into a tangible pressure that felt like thin, serrated wire being slowly wound around his eyeballs. He would lie motionless for hours, staring at the ceiling as the frequency vibrated through the frame of his bed and into his very marrow. Every time he closed his eyes, the sound seemed to glow behind his eyelids, a pulsing neon streak of auditory agony that made the act of resting impossible. The silence of the night was his greatest enemy, for it stripped away all distractions, leaving him alone with the oscillating demon that had taken up permanent residence in the hollows of his brain. The mundane details of his apartment began to take on a sinister, distorted character as the months dragged on toward 2025. The microscopic motes of dust dancing in the afternoon sun no longer looked like simple debris, they seemed to be vibrating in synchronization with the scream, sounding to his hypersensitive mind like the shifting of a million tiny shards of broken glass. The light from the single, yellowed bulb in his hallway added its own dirty overtone to the symphony, a low-frequency buzz that grated against the primary screech like sandpaper on an open wound. He found himself avoiding the kitchen because the hum of the refrigerator felt like a physical assault, a mechanical growl that threatened to tear his consciousness into jagged pieces. Even the smell of the room, the scent of stale coffee and unwashed linens, seemed to carry the metallic tang of the sound, as if the air itself had been electrified. In moments of absolute desperation, Arthur would seize the heavy pillows from his bed and press them against his ears until his muscles shook with the effort, trying to crush the sound into non-existence. It was a futile gesture, for the noise did not enter through his ear canals, it originated from deep within the bone, a vestigial signal broadcasting from the dark center of his own gray matter. He could feel the vibration deep in his jaw, a constant, aching pressure that made his molars throb and his sinuses burn with phantom heat. The more he fought to find a moment of peace, the more the sound seemed to respond, rising in volume and intensity until his vision blurred and his thoughts became nothing more than fragmented reflections in a shattered mirror. His brain felt as though it were slowly boiling within the confines of his skull, a soft tissue stewing in a cauldron of high-frequency radiation. By the time the calendar turned to the 10th of October, the noise had stripped away the man he used to be, leaving behind a hollow shell driven by a single, desperate need for silence. He had begun to see patterns in the fluctuations of the tone, short bursts of static and rhythmic clicks that felt like a cold finger tapping against the inside of his forehead. The frequency was no longer a random affliction, it had become a set of instructions, a series of invisible markers that tugged at his consciousness like a leash. He stood in the center of his living room, surrounded by the wreckage of his former life, and realized that the sound was not trying to kill him, but rather, it was calling him toward a destination he could no longer ignore. The silver needle in his mind had become a compass, and for the first time in over a year, Arthur Vance stopped resisting and began to listen to the geometry of the noise. By the 14th month of his unending nightmare, the monolithic wall of frequency, which had once been a smooth and impenetrable slab of auditory marble, began to develop hairline fractures. The change was subtle at first, occurring somewhere in the hollow silence between midnight and dawn when the rest of the world seemed to hold its breath. Arthur sat paralyzed on the cold linoleum of his kitchen floor, his back pressed against the vibrating metal of the refrigerator, when he realized the hum was no longer a single, agonizing line. It had begun to fray at the edges, manifesting as jagged interruptions and sudden, violent hitches in the transmission that felt like a serrated blade being drawn across the inner surface of his eardrums. These were not random glitches, but deliberate, rhythmic stutters that possessed the mechanical precision of a phantom telegraph operator working in a void. The kitchen had become a tomb of domestic decay, illuminated only by the sickly, flickering green glow of a digital clock that had long since stopped keeping correct time. Arthur was surrounded by a fortress of empty tin cans, their silver lids pulled back like gaping, metallic maws that exhaled the faint, cloying scent of preserved salt and stale grease. The air in the room was heavy, thick with the smell of coffee that had been brewed and forgotten days ago, leaving a bitter, oily film on the surface of the mugs scattered across the countertops. He sat in the center of this squalor, his fingers trembling as they gripped a stubby pencil, listening to the new texture of his torment. The sound had evolved into something tactile, a rough, dry scraping that reminded him of heavy grit sandpaper being dragged slowly over the grain of ancient, weathered wood. Between the scrapes came the clicks, short, sharp, and wet, resembling the sound of a heavy relay station submerged in thick, viscous oil. Each pulse of noise sent a corresponding shiver through Arthur's jaw, a sympathetic vibration that made his teeth ache as if they were being struck by a tuning fork. He began to track the intervals, his eyes fixed on a notebook whose pages were already bloated with frantic, illegible scribbles and the dark stains of spilled caffeine. The rhythm was undeniable, a complex sequence of pauses and bursts that bypassed his ears entirely and resonated directly within the fluid of his inner ear. It was no longer a symptom to be endured, but a message to be transcribed, a frantic dictation from a source that occupied the very center of his consciousness. By the time the calendar of his mind drifted into the gray, oppressive chill of October 2025, Arthur had become a ghost in his own skin. His eyes were deeply recessed into his skull, surrounded by halos of bruised, purple skin that spoke of 1,000 hours spent in the company of the noise. His hair was lank and matted with the dust of his self-imposed isolation, and his movements had become jerky, dictated by the staccato bursts of the signal that now governed his central nervous system. He no longer looked at the world outside his window, for the gray Oregon rain streaking the glass only served to remind him of the static that filled his head. He lived entirely for the clicks, for the moments when the sandpaper roar subsided just enough to reveal the numerical sequences hidden within the static. The coordinates began to take shape on the 100th page of his ledger, written in a hand so cramped and shaky it looked like the tracks of a dying insect. They were a series of longitudes and latitudes that pointed toward a blind spot in the deep, emerald shadows of the Oregon wilderness, far beyond the reach of paved roads and cellular towers. As he traced the numbers with a cracked fingernail, the sound in his head responded with a sudden, triumphant surge in volume, a roar of approval that made his nose bleed a single, dark drop of crimson onto the paper. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. This was not a neurological collapse or a descent into schizophrenia. It was a summons, a magnetic pull that was aligning the iron in his blood with a distant, hidden heart buried deep beneath the earth. He stood up from the floor, his joints popping with the sound of dry twigs snapping underfoot, and began to move with a renewed, feverish purpose that he had not felt since the 3rd of May, 2024. The sound was no longer his captor, it had become his navigator, pulsing in perfect, violent synchronization with the frantic thudding of his heart. Every step he took toward the door caused the frequency to shift, the pitch rising into a keen, expectant whistle that seemed to pull him forward by the very bridge of his nose. He gathered his few remaining belongings, a heavy flashlight, a tattered coat that smelled of mothballs and despair, and the notebook that held his salvation, and moved toward the darkened hallway. The air in the apartment felt thin and exhausted, as if the room itself were relieved to see him leave. The garage was a damp, concrete cavern that smelled of old motor oil and the slow, oxidizing rot of damp cardboard. Arthur's old SUV sat in the shadows like a hibernating beast, its dark green paint obscured by a thick layer of gray grime and fallen leaves that had blown in through the cracked door. When he slid into the driver's seat, The scent of stale tobacco and cold upholstery enveloped him, a sensory reminder of the man he had been before the vibration took hold. He gripped the steering wheel, and the plastic felt freezing against his palms, yet he could feel the engine's potential energy vibrating through the steering column before he even turned the key. The sound in his head was now a constant, urgent scream, a siren that demanded he breach the silence of the forest. When the engine finally turned over, it did so with a reluctant, throat-clearing growl that echoed off the low ceiling of the garage, filling the space with the acrid, blue-gray haze of exhaust. The mechanical vibration of the vehicle merged seamlessly with the electrical vibration in Arthur's skull, creating a terrifying harmony that made his vision swim in a sea of static. He backed out of the driveway, the tires crunching over the gravel with a sound like breaking bone, and turned his headlights toward the dark, wet ribbon of the highway. Behind him, the house he had occupied during his long descent into madness stood silent and dark, a hollow shell no longer capable of containing the force that was now driving him toward the wilderness. As he drove, the streetlights of the city began to thin, replaced by the towering, skeletal silhouettes of Douglas firs that crowded the edges of the road. The rain fell in heavy, rhythmic sheets, drumming against the roof of the SUV with a sound like 1,000 tiny fingers searching for a way inside. Arthur did not use the radio, for the symphony in his mind was far more complex than anything broadcast by men, a howling, electric wind that grew more furious with every mile he traveled toward the northwest. The dashboard lights cast a ghostly green glow over his gaunt features, making him look like a passenger on a ferry crossing a dark and silent river. He was no longer Arthur Vance, the victim of a mysterious ailment. He was a needle being drawn toward a massive, invisible magnet hidden in the dark heart of the woods. The tires of the old SUV crunched over the final patch of gravel before the forest swallowed the road entirely, leaving Arthur Vance in a kingdom of towering shadows and ancient, unyielding wood. He stepped out of the vehicle, and the transition from the mechanical hum of the engine to the heavy, oppressive stillness of the Oregon wilderness was a physical blow. The air was thick and cold, saturated with the pungent, cloying scent of damp pine needles and the sharp, mineral tang of wet stone that seemed to seep into his clothes instantly. Around him, the Douglas firs stood like silent sentinels, their branches interlocking overhead to create a ceiling of needles that filtered the dying light into a dim, greenish haze. Arthur leaned against the door of the car, his knuckles white as he gripped the handle, waiting for the world to stop spinning as the vibration in his skull adjusted to the absence of the engine's roar. As he turned away from the last remnant of civilization, the noise inside his head surged with a newfound, predatory ferocity, shifting from a high-pitched scream into a low, guttural thrum. It was no longer a mere frequency, it had become a visceral growl, a subterranean vibration that felt like a massive, starving beast pacing behind the bars of an iron cage located somewhere in the center of his brain. Every step he took into the tree line sent a jolt of sympathetic resonance through his spine, a rhythmic pulsing that seemed to vibrate the very fluid in his eyes. The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of thick, emerald moss that drank the sound of his heavy boots, creating an eerie illusion of absolute deafness that was broken only by the violent, internal storm of the signal. He felt as though he were walking through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare, where the laws of physics had been replaced by the dictates of a hidden, mechanical god. The deeper he ventured, the more the natural world seemed to recoil from his presence, the birds falling silent and the wind dying down to a breathless, expectant hush. The moss beneath his feet was unnervingly soft, a sponge-like layer of decay that gave way with a sickening, wet squelch at every step, threatening to pull him down into the black earth. The scent of rot was more pronounced here, the smell of fallen trees dissolving into peat and the faint, sweet odor of fungus thriving in the perpetual gloom. Arthur's breath came in ragged, visible plumes of silver vapor, his lungs burning with the effort of navigating the dense undergrowth and the steep, rocky inclines that felt like the ribs of the earth. His hands were raw, scratched by the grasping fingers of dry brambles, but he felt no pain, only the magnetic pull that was now a white-hot coal burning behind his forehead. The sky above began to bruise and darken, transforming from a pale, sickly gray into the deep, bruised hue of a rotting plum as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon of the peaks. This transition brought no relief, only a tightening of the shadows and a sharpening of the cold that seemed to vibrate in harmony with the roar in his ears. Arthur pushed through a final, dense thicket of ferns, their fronds brushing against his face like cold, wet tongues, and found himself in a small, natural clearing dominated by a single, colossal spruce tree. Its roots were like gnarled, obsidian limbs, twisting and coiling over the ground in a desperate struggle for space, and as Arthur's eyes followed the line of the lowest root, he saw it, the sharp, unnatural edge of a gray concrete slab peeking out from beneath the encroaching earth. He approached the slab with a slow, trembling reverence, the noise in his head rising to a deafening, triumphant crescendo that made his vision flicker with streaks of static. The concrete was old, its surface etched with the deep, greenish-black stains of lichen and the fine, hairline cracks of decades of exposure to the elements. It sat there like an intruder, a geometric blasphemy in the middle of the organic chaos of the forest, half buried under a layer of needles and dead leaves. Arthur reached out a hand, his fingers hovering just inches above the cold, abrasive surface before finally making contact, and the moment his skin touched the stone, the world seemed to snap into focus. The vibration in his palm was an exact, terrifying match for the rhythm in his ears, a perfect synchronization of flesh and machine that made his heart hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. With a frantic energy, he began to clear away the debris, his fingernails clawing at the frozen earth and the matted needles until the full extent of the concrete structure was revealed. It was a heavy, square lid, set flush into the ground and anchored by a frame of rusted, pitted iron that looked as though it hadn't been touched in half a century. In the center of the lid was a recessed handle, a thick ring of metal that was choked with orange rust and the skeletal remains of dead insects. Arthur gripped the handle with both hands, his boots slipping on the wet moss as he braced himself, his muscles screaming in protest against the sheer, dead weight of the iron. He pulled with every ounce of his remaining strength, his breath coming in jagged gasps that echoed off the surrounding trees, until finally, with a sound that felt like the earth itself was being torn apart, the seal broke. The metal handle groaned, a long, agonizing shriek of protesting iron that vibrated through Arthur's arms and settled in the marrow of his teeth. The lid moved an inch, then two, exhaling a puff of air that smelled of ancient dust, cold grease, and a strange, metallic ozone that bit at the back of his throat. He threw his entire weight backward, and the hatch flipped open with a dull, heavy thud, disappearing into the tall grass and leaving a yawning, rectangular void in the forest floor. Below him lay a darkness so absolute it seemed to possess its own weight, a lightless chimney that plummeted into the belly of the mountain. The sound of the falling lid echoed down the shaft, a series of receding metallic clangs that seemed to go on forever, suggesting a depth that defied his understanding of the terrain. Arthur knelt at the edge of the opening, the cold air from below rising to meet him like the breath of a corpse. He fumbled for the heavy flashlight at his belt, his fingers clumsy and numb, and clicked it on, the beam of artificial light cutting a violent path through the gloom. It revealed the upper rungs of a vertical ladder, constructed from the same heavy, rusted iron as the hatch, bolted directly into the weeping concrete walls of the shaft. The rungs were slick with a fine film of moisture, and as the light traveled further down, it lost its battle with the dark, leaving only the suggestion of an endless, descending spine. The air rising from the depths carried a faint, rhythmic humming that was now audible to his physical ears, a low-frequency drone that vibrated in his chest and made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He swung his legs over the edge, his boots finding the first rung with a hollow, metallic ring that seemed to vibrate all the way up through his hip bones. The ladder felt precariously thin under his weight, the rust flaking off in sharp, orange scales that coated his palms and stung the small cuts on his fingers. As he began his descent, the world above, the purple sky, the ancient spruce, the smell of the pine, started to recede, becoming a shrinking square of dim light that offered less and less comfort with every foot he climbed down. The walls of the shaft were narrow, pressing in on him with a claustrophobic weight, their surfaces slick with a black, oily slime that smelled of old machinery and stagnant water. He was leaving the realm of the living, sinking into a vertical tomb that had been waiting for him since the day the vibration first took hold of his soul. 20 feet down, the light from the surface was nothing more than a faint, mocking glimmer, and Arthur was forced to rely entirely on the narrow beam of his flashlight, which danced nervously over the rusted iron and the sweating concrete. The air here was noticeably heavier, thicker with the scent of ozone and the dry, suffocating aroma of 1,000 years of trapped dust. He could hear his own heart, a wet, frantic thudding that seemed to compete with the mechanical drone rising from below, creating a polyrhythmic chaos that threatened to unseat his mind. His hands were cramped into claws, the cold iron leaching the heat from his body until his joints felt like they were made of brittle glass, yet he did not stop, for the pull of the signal was now an irresistible command. Another 30 feet, and the temperature dropped sharply, the air becoming so frigid that his breath began to crystallize on the rungs of the ladder. The shaft began to widen slightly, the concrete walls giving way to a more complex structure of reinforced steel plates and thick, armored cables that ran like black veins down toward the source of the noise. The humming was no longer a sound, it was a physical environment, a medium through which he moved like a diver descending into a sunless sea. He felt a strange, terrifying sense of homecoming, a realization that the agony of the past year had been nothing more than the process of being tuned to this specific, subterranean frequency. The latter finally ended, his boots hitting a solid floor with a sound that was muffled by a thick layer of fine, gray silt, and Arthur stood in the heart of the darkness, his flashlight trembling in his hand. He turned the beam slowly, sweeping it across the room he had entered, and the light revealed a space that was both a bunker and a cathedral of forgotten technology. The walls were lined with massive, silent cabinets of vacuum tubes and copper wiring, their glass faces reflecting his light like the unblinking eyes of an ancient, sleeping god. The floor was a grid of steel grates, and beneath them, he could see the faint, rhythmic pulse of a green light, deep in the guts of the machine. The smell here was overwhelming, a concentrated essence of heated metal, old electricity, and the absolute absence of life. Arthur took a tentative step forward, the silt on the floor puffing up in small, silent clouds around his ankles, and as he moved toward the center of the room, the noise in his head finally fell into a perfect, terrifying stillness, replaced by the thrum of the physical world around him. Arthur stood at the base of the rusted iron ladder, his chest heaving as he inhaled the stagnant, refrigerated air of the subterranean vault. The absolute darkness of the shaft had been replaced by a dim, sickly luminescence that seemed to bleed from the very walls, though no visible light source revealed itself. His ears, which had endured 14 months of internal screaming, now felt as though they were being crushed by an external force, a barometric pressure so intense it made the delicate bones of his inner ear throb with a dull, bruised ache. The silence of the forest above was a distant memory, replaced here by a heavy, atmospheric weight that tasted of cold copper and calcified dust. He remained motionless for several minutes, his flashlight beam trembling as it cut through the thick veil of suspended particles, watching the way the light died against the oppressive, weeping concrete. The walls of the corridor were slick with a dark, oily condensation that gathered into fat droplets, clinging to the ceiling before succumbing to gravity. Each drop fell with a sharp, resonant crack against the shallow pools of brackish water on the floor, a sound that echoed through the narrow space like the ticking of a gargantuan, waterlogged clock. Arthur began to move, his boots creating a wet, rhythmic splashing that felt unnervingly loud in the confined space, a sound that the bunker seemed to swallow and distort. The smell was overwhelming here, a suffocating mixture of wet limestone, ancient electricity, and the sweet, cloying scent of slow, metallic oxidation. He followed the curve of the wall, his shoulder occasionally brushing against the freezing concrete, feeling the microscopic vibrations of the structure through his heavy coat. As he rounded the final corner, the corridor opened into a vast, vaulted chamber that felt more like a hollowed-out cathedral than a functional military bunker. In the center of this cavernous space sat a massive iron installation, a monolithic block of machinery that seemed to anchor the entire mountain to the earth. It was a brutalist altar of blackened steel and burnished brass, rising nearly 15 feet into the darkness of the ceiling, its surface shrouded in thick, gray blankets of dust and ancient, dusty spiderwebs. The machine did not merely sit in the room, it occupied it with a predatory presence, exhaling a low, guttural thrum that made the very air in the chamber quiver. This was the source of the vibration that had haunted his life, a mechanical heart beating in the dark, and seeing it made the phantom needle in Arthur's skull pulse with a sudden, agonizing heat. The hum was no longer a sound that Arthur perceived with his ears, it had become a physical environment, a subterranean tide that surged through his marrow and vibrated against his internal organs. He could feel his lungs trembling in time with the machine's internal cycles, his very breath synchronized with the unseen pistons and cooling fans that labored within the iron shell. It was a deep, infrasonic growl that bypassed the senses and spoke directly to the base of his brain, a sound that felt like the earth itself was moaning in a fitful, feverish sleep. His stomach churned with a sudden, violent nausea as the frequency shifted, a low-frequency oscillation that made the fluid in his eyes vibrate until the edges of the room began to blur into a chaotic smear of gray and black. Dozens of small, circular lamps were embedded in the machine's face, their glass covers clouded by decades of grime and the residue of heat. They did not shine with the crisp clarity of modern electronics, but instead emitted a weak, pulsating orange glow that reminded Arthur of the dying embers of a forest fire. This light was flickery and unstable, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the weeping walls like the limbs of some many-legged creature. The orange light caught the swirling dust in the air, turning the atmosphere into a thick, golden soup that seemed to resist his movements. Each pulse of the lights coincided with a sharp, electric pop from the depths of the unit, a sound like a small bone snapping in a distant room, followed by the acrid, biting smell of scorched insulation. Near the center of the control array, two massive vertical spools were turning with an agonizing slowness, their mechanical movement nearly silent. Magnetic tape, dark and shimmering like the skin of a deep-sea eel, threaded its way through a complex labyrinth of brass rollers and silver guides. As the tape moved, it produced a soft, dry whispering sound, a frantic shushing that resembled the collective breath of 1,000 dying voices gathered in a single, cramped space. Arthur leaned closer, the beam of his flashlight illuminating the microscopic textures of the tape as it hissed past the playback heads. The sound was hypnotic, a multi-layered tapestry of static and white noise that seemed to contain the echoes of every scream and every whispered secret ever uttered into the void. Arthur took a tentative step toward the main console, his hand reaching out as if drawn by an invisible wire toward the row of heavy, industrial switches. The metal of the machine was freezing, yet it throbbed with an internal heat that he could feel radiating against his palms before he even made contact. The texture of the control panel was rough, pitted by decades of slow corrosion and coated in a thin, greasy film that clung to his skin like old oil. There were no labels in any language he recognized, only etched symbols that looked like the jagged teeth of a saw or the stylized waves of a violent sea. His fingers hovered over a large, three-position toggle switch that was locked into place by a lead seal, the wire of the seal glinting like a silver thread in the orange gloom. He realized then, with a clarity that was both terrifying and absolute, that this machine was not a recording device or a simple receiver. It was a massive, high-output transmitter, a broadcast station of unimaginable power that was pumping a concentrated stream of information directly into the ionosphere. For reasons he could not comprehend, whether by a genetic fluke or a localized distortion of spacetime during his birth, his own neural pathways had become entangled with the frequency of this specific broadcast. He was the unintended audience for a message that was meant for the stars, a biological antenna that had been vibrating to the rhythm of a cosmic monologue. The pain in his head was the sound of a signal being forced through a medium never intended to carry it, a river of fire being poured into a vessel of clay. The realization sent a fresh wave of tremors through his hands, the cold sweat on his forehead stinging his eyes as it mixed with the dust of the bunker. He looked at the vast array of vacuum tubes glowing behind a reinforced mesh screen, their internal filaments white-hot and shimmering with a frantic, caged energy. They looked like organs kept alive in a glass jar, pulsating with the raw power required to bridge the gap between worlds. The machine was a living thing, a mechanical god that had chosen him as its prophet, and every second he spent in its presence felt like his soul was being slowly unspooled and fed into the rotating tapes. The air grew even hotter, the smell of ozone becoming so thick he could taste the electricity on the back of his tongue, a metallic bitterness that made his throat constrict. He pressed his forehead against the cold iron of the console, the vibration rattling his skull until he thought his teeth might shatter in their sockets. In this position, the internal noise and the external hum merged into a single, unified roar, a state of auditory nervousness where the pain became so intense it transcended itself and became a form of dark peace. He was no longer a man standing in a forest, he was a component of the machine, a final circuit closer that had traveled across the state to complete the loop. The whispering of the tapes grew louder, the voices within the static becoming more distinct, almost forming words that hovered on the edge of his understanding. He stood there for an eternity, a ghost in a tomb of iron, listening to the heartbeat of a secret that the world had forgotten, but which had never forgotten him. Arthur stood before the main control interface, his shadow stretched long and distorted against the weeping concrete wall by the flickering orange glow of the dying vacuum tubes. His gaze was fixed upon the primary master switch, a gargantuan iron lever that seemed to grow out of the machine's rusted chassis like a protruding, metallic rib. The surface of the handle was scarred with deep, frantic etchings, symbols that resembled the jagged teeth of a saw or the chaotic spikes of a seismic graph, carved with such violence that the metal had curled at the edges of the grooves. Though the language was alien and the purpose of the bunker remained a dark mystery, Arthur's mind, honed by 14 months of auditory torture, understood the geometry of the mechanism with a terrifying, instinctive clarity. He knew that this lever was the anchor of the signal, the final gatekeeper of the frequency that had been unmaking his soul since the 3rd of May. The vibration in the chamber had reached a fever pitch, a physical roar that seemed to liquefy the air and turn the very floor beneath his boots into a shifting, unstable sea of static. In his skull, the silver needle had expanded into a white-hot rod of agonizing pressure, vibrating at a frequency so high it felt as though his brain were being vibrated into a fine, gray mist. His teeth ached with a deep, pulpy throb, each nerve ending singing in a chorus of high-altitude misery, while the capillaries in his eyes began to surrender to the strain. Tiny, crimson threads bloomed across the whites of his eyes, blurring his vision into a hazy, pink-tinged nightmare, yet he did not blink. He could feel the heat radiating from the machine, a dry, electric furnace breath that smelled of scorched copper and the ancient, metallic dust of 1,000 years, parching his throat and stinging his nostrils. With a hand that shook with the collective exhaustion of 1,000 sleepless nights, Arthur reached out and closed his fingers around the freezing iron of the handle. The contact was a violent shock, a surge of pure kinetic energy that traveled up his arm and settled in his shoulder like a heavy, leaden weight. The lever was caked in a thick, oily residue that clung to his palm, a mixture of archaic lubricant and the oxidized sweat of whoever had last stood in this tomb of technology. He braced his feet against the steel grating of the floor, feeling the rhythmic thrum of the spinning magnetic tapes vibrating through the soles of his boots and into his very marrow. The machine seemed to sense his intent, the orange lights pulsing with a frantic, desperate intensity, and the whispering from the reels rose into a cacophonous, overlapping scream of static that demanded his submission. He began to pull, his muscles bunching and straining against the immense, dead resistance of the mechanism, which had been fused in place by decades of atmospheric neglect and chemical corrosion. A low, guttural groan escaped his throat, drowned out by the mechanical roar, as he threw the entirety of his emaciated weight against the iron bar. He could feel the internal tension of the machine through the handle, the sensation of massive copper coils straining and heavy relays vibrating on the verge of failure. The smell of ozone became a choking cloud, a sharp, metallic bitterness that coated his tongue and made his lungs burn with every ragged breath. His heart hammered against his ribs with a frantic, irregular rhythm, competing with the throb of the transmitter as he forced the lever to move, inch by painful inch, through the crust of rust and time. Then, with a sudden, violent snap that echoed through the vaulted chamber like the crack of a titan's whip, the resistance gave way. The lever plummeted downward into its final position, and for a fraction of a second, the entire room was illuminated by a blinding, sapphire-blue arc of electricity that leaped from the contact points. The light was so intense it seared the silhouette of the machine onto Arthur's retinas, a ghost image of iron and wires that hovered in the darkness even after the flash had faded. There was a sound of immense, dying energy, a long, descending whine that started at the edge of human hearing and slid down into a subterranean growl before vanishing into the earth. The spinning tapes jerked to a violent halt, the magnetic ribbons snapping and fluttering like the wings of a dying bird, and the orange glow of the vacuum tubes flickered once before turning into cold, dark glass. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound, it was a physical entity, a crushing, velvet weight that dropped from the ceiling and pinned Arthur to the spot. It was so sudden and so absolute that for a terrifying moment, he believed he had been struck deaf or that the shock had finally killed him. The air, which had been a vibrating soup of static and heat, became still and frigid, the only movement being the slow, graceful descent of dust particles that were no longer agitated by the hum. This silence had a texture, thick, heavy, and suffocating, like being buried alive in a tomb of soft ash. He stood paralyzed, his hand still gripped around the cold iron lever, waiting for the needle in his head to return, for the screeching frequency to resume its assault on his sanity. But there was nothing. For the first time in over a year, the internal storm had broken, leaving behind a hollow, echoing cavern where the pain used to live. Arthur began to hear the sounds of his own biological existence, noises that had been buried under the roar for 14 agonizing months. He heard the wet, rhythmic thud of his own heart, a slow and steady beat that sounded like a distant drum in an empty hall. He heard the dry, rasping whistle of his breath as it moved through his constricted throat, and the faint, high-pitched ringing of his nervous system trying to adjust to the vacuum of sound. Each swallow was a loud, cavernous event, and the shifting of his coat as he moved felt like the roar of an avalanche. The tension that had kept his body taut as a bowstring for over 400 days began to dissolve, starting at the base of his skull and washing down his spine in a cold, tingly wave of relief. His knees, no longer supported by the frantic energy of the vibration, buckled beneath him, and he sank slowly to the cold concrete floor. The surface was wet and abrasive, but to Arthur, it felt like the softest silk, a solid anchor in a world that had stopped shaking. He leaned his back against the base of the silent machine, the iron now nothing more than a cold, dead monument to a forgotten purpose. He drew in a long, shuddering breath, the air tasting of damp stone and the fading ghost of ozone, and felt the primal, animal terror of the last year begin to drain away into the black water at his feet. He closed his eyes, and instead of the frantic, neon streaks of auditory pain, he saw only the peaceful, velvety darkness of the bunker. The I that had been his constant companion, the silver needle that had stitched his thoughts together with thread of fire, was gone. He felt a strange, light-headed buoyancy, as if he were a diver finally breaking the surface of a lightless ocean and inhaling the first sweet gulp of oxygen. The silence was a benediction, a holy thing that he wanted to wrap around himself and never let go. He didn't care about the darkness, or the depth of the hole he was in, or the miles of Oregon wilderness that lay between him and his empty home. He was a man who had been granted a reprieve from a life sentence of noise, and in that moment, the damp, lightless bunker was the most beautiful place in the universe. As he sat there, his chin resting on his chest, a single, hot tear traced a path through the grime and dust on his cheek, falling onto his hand with a tiny, audible splash that made him smile in the dark. He felt a profound sense of freedom, a lightness of being that made him feel as though he might simply float away from the concrete floor and vanish into the shadows of the ceiling. The paranoia, the fear of his own mind, the desperate search for an end, all of it had been silenced by the simple act of pulling a lever. He stayed there for what felt like hours, drifting in the sensory deprivation of the absolute quiet, breathing in the dust of the ages and listening to the beautiful, uncomplicated silence of his own soul. He was Arthur Vance again, and for the first time since the 3rd of May, he was finally, mercifully alone in his own head. Arthur gripped the rusted rungs of the ladder with fingers that felt strangely light, the absence of the internal vibration making his own body seem foreign and weightless. His ascent from the bowels of the bunker was a slow, deliberate crawl through the damp vertical tomb, each movement accompanied by the rhythmic scraping of his heavy coat against the sweating concrete walls. The silence followed him up like a rising tide, a thick and velvety vacuum that made the sound of his own joints popping feel like the snapping of dry timber in a quiet valley. He reached the upper rim of the shaft and paused, his breath hitching in his throat as he looked up at the rectangular patch of the night sky, which appeared as a deep, bruised violet against the black silhouette of the hatch. The air rising from the forest floor felt sharp and vital, lacking the metallic bite of the machine's ozone, yet as he pulled himself over the edge and into the grass, he felt a sudden, inexplicable chill that had nothing to do with the Oregon autumn. He stood on the mossy clearing, his legs trembling slightly as he adjusted to the true, unadulterated stillness of the wilderness. For the first time since the 3rd of May, 2024, the world was allowed to be what it was, without the frantic, electric overlay of the silver needle in his skull. He looked around the clearing, the ancient spruce tree standing like a silent, watchful giant in the gloom, its branches motionless in the breathless air. The scent of the forest was overwhelming now, the deep, earthy musk of rotting needles, the cold scent of wet stone, and the faint, sweet aroma of wild fungus, all of it magnified by the death of the hum. He felt a profound sense of triumph, a quiet ecstasy of the senses that made him want to weep, and he turned his face toward the heavens to offer his gratitude to the stars. The sky was a vast, crystalline dome, scattered with a billion points of cold, white light that seemed to pulse with a slow and steady rhythm. Arthur remained motionless, his head tilted back until his neck ached, drinking in the celestial display that had been hidden from him by the veil of his own agony. But as he watched, a subtle wrongness began to manifest in the geometry of the constellations. A star in the northern quadrant did not twinkle, it simply vanished, as if an invisible ink had been spilled across the velvet of the cosmos. Then another, closer to the horizon, winked out of existence, followed by a cluster of lights in the belt of an ancient hunter. It was as if a massive, lightless hand were being drawn across the sky, a silent eraser moving with a terrifying, calculated speed. It was then that the new sound arrived, and it was nothing like the high-pitched, internal shriek that had haunted his life. This was an external, atmospheric phenomenon, a low-frequency groan that seemed to emanate from the very roof of the world. It was a sound of immense physical displacement, the groan of the stratosphere being torn asunder by a weight that the laws of physics should not have allowed. It resembled the sound of 1,000 tectonic plates grinding together, or the agonizing moan of a ship's hull being crushed in the grip of a frozen sea. The vibration did not touch Arthur's ears first, it hit his sternum, a deep, resonant thrum that made the air in his lungs feel heavy and viscous, as if he were breathing liquid lead. The shadows began to descend, not as clouds or mist, but as colossal, geometric voids that were darker than the night surrounding them. These were city-sized monoliths of obsidian and shadow, ships that possessed no lights and no visible means of propulsion, sliding silently through the atmosphere like sharks through a lightless deep. As they lowered themselves from the void, they began to blot out the moon, casting the forest into an absolute, suffocating darkness that felt like a physical weight on Arthur's shoulders. The trees around the clearing began to sway, not from the wind, but from the sheer gravitational wake of the vessels, their branches groaning and snapping with the sound of dry bone. The scent of the forest was suddenly replaced by a sharp, chemical sting, an alien aroma of frozen methane and burnt starlight that made Arthur's eyes water. A dull, gray light began to bleed from the underbellies of the ships, a sickly luminescence that did not illuminate the forest so much as it stripped it of its color. Under this necrotic glow, the emerald moss turned the color of ash, and the vibrant needles of the spruce tree looked like rusted needles of iron. Arthur stood paralyzed in the center of the clearing, his shadow stretching out before him like a long, accusing finger pointing back toward the open hatch of the bunker. The realization began to bloom in the center of his chest, a cold and hollow certainty that made his heart stutter in its rhythm. The noise in his head had not been a curse, and the bunker had not been a tomb, they were the components of a gargantuan, planetary shroud, an acoustic wall designed to scream into the void so that nothing from the outside could hear the whispers of the world within. The machine he had silenced was a jammer, a desperate, ancient beacon that had been broadcasting a keep-away signal for decades, a wall of static that made the Earth appear as a dead, noisy rock to the predators prowling the darkness between the stars. By pulling that lever, by seeking the selfish peace of his own mind, Arthur had turned off the lighthouse in a sea full of monsters. The I that had driven him to the brink of madness was the sound of a shield holding firm, a barrier that had protected 8 billion souls by drowning out their very existence. Now, in the perfect, terrifying silence he had created, the heartbeats of humanity were finally audible to those who had been searching for them in the dark. The ships continued their descent, the sound of the air being pulverized beneath their massive hulls becoming an all-consuming roar that drowned out the rustle of the trees. Arthur felt the ground begin to shake, a true, tectonic vibration that made the stones in the clearing dance and the water in the puddles leap in frantic, geometric patterns. From the belly of the closest vessel, 4 massive, spindly appendages began to extend, reaching down toward the forest floor like the legs of a celestial spider. They were made of a material that seemed to drink the gray light, a matte black substance that looked both liquid and solid at the same time. The scale of the mechanism was incomprehensible, a feat of engineering that reduced the bunker and its vacuum tubes to the level of a child's toy. The first leg made contact with the Earth a mile to the west, and the shock wave reached the clearing a second later, a wall of displaced air and dirt that knocked Arthur off his feet. He hit the moss hard, the breath driven from his body in a wet gasp, but he did not try to stand. He lay there, his cheek pressed against the freezing ground, and heard the sound of the impact, a heavy, wet, and rhythmic thud that felt like a butcher's cleaver hitting a slab of meat. It was followed by a series of high-pitched, harmonic whistles that vibrated through the soil, a language of pure mathematics and cold intent that made the hair on Arthur's arms stand in frozen terror. The sky was now entirely gone, replaced by the textured, vaulted ceiling of the ship's undercarriage, a landscape of pipes, vents, and strange, pulsing membranes. The smell of the alien atmosphere became so thick it was nearly a liquid, a cloying, metallic fog that tasted of copper and ancient, recycled breath. Arthur watched as the second and third legs found their purchase, the forest screaming as ancient trees were pulverized into splinters and the very bedrock of the mountain was crushed under the impossible weight. The silence he had craved so desperately had become his executioner, a void that had been filled by a sound far more terrifying than any frequency his mind could have conjured. He realized then that the doctors had been right to be silent, for there were no words in the human tongue to describe the catastrophe he had invited by seeking his own comfort. He was the man who had ended the world because he couldn't handle a ringing in his ears. The gray light intensified, turning the clearing into a sterile, surgical theater where every detail was exposed in brutal, flat clarity. He could see the individual needles on the spruce tree vibrating until they shattered, and he could see the dust rising from the bunker hatch in a slow, swirling column. The air grew cold, a deep space frost that began to crystallize on the surface of his coat and the skin of his hands, turning the moisture of his breath into a fine, white powder. The ships were not here to communicate or to observe, they were here to harvest, their arrival marked by the same mechanical indifference a farmer shows to a field of ripe wheat. A final, earth-shattering boom signaled the arrival of the fourth leg, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The vibration was so intense that Arthur felt the capillaries in his ears finally burst, not from the internal noise, but from the external pressure of the arriving gods. A warm trickle of blood began to flow down his neck, a sensation that was strangely distant and unimportant. He closed his eyes, the gray light burning through his eyelids, and tried to remember the sound of the silver needle, the I that had been his constant companion for 14 months. He found himself wishing for it, praying for the return of the agony, for the return of the shield that had kept the shadows at bay. But the silence remained, deep and absolute, broken only by the wet, heavy thuds of the landing struts and the low, atmospheric groan of a world being claimed. The peace he had found at the bottom of the bunker was a lie, a brief intermission before the final act of a tragedy he had authored with his own hand. As the first shadows of the harvesting drones began to detach from the mothership and drift down toward the trees like black, fluttering moths, Arthur Vance lay in the dirt and realized the ultimate, horrific irony of his journey. The silence of the universe was not a gift, it was a predator's breath, and he had spent his life trying to open the door to the very thing that was now coming to consume him. The silence was here, and it was the last thing humanity would ever know.